My name is Sarah Eagger. I'm chair of the Jayanti Foundation and your host for the day. And on behalf of the Jayanti Foundation and the Brahma Kumaris who are letting us use their premises, we wish you a very warm welcome. The Jayanti Foundation is an organisation which was originally set up over 20 years ago to support the hospital in India, a hospital at the top of Mount Abu, which looks after the health of quite a deprived community, desert and village people. And the Brahma Kumaris headquarters is there, so all of us have also benefited a lot from attending that hospital when we visited Mount Abu. And even though that charity is set up really to fundraise for that hospital, Daddy Jayanti, who some of you may know, who's the head of the Brahma Kumaris, who's 102, very good example of long life and good health. She said, well, you can't just raise money, you really have to serve people spiritually. So a lot of our activities, the values in healthcare, different publications we've had, and seminars and retreats, because we want to share the spiritual aspect of healthcare with people as much as possible. And we'd like to, so we're separate to the Brahma Kumaris, but we are affiliated in the sense that it's supporting that community, and we would like to thank them for allowing us to use this premises today and providing the lunch, etc. But Dying Matters Week is a very interesting thing that started in the UK to really try and raise the profile of talking about death and making it a less of a taboo subject. During that week, there was a blog on the BMA website where a doctor was reporting a survey that they'd done to doctors and members of the public on end-of-life care and physician-assisted dying. And what they found when they did that research was that for many members of the public involved in that research, it was the first time that they'd considered or talked about end of life. And most people said they found those conversations very uncomfortable and relatively taboo. And few had made firm plans for the end of life. Only 38% had written a will, only 11% had planned their funeral, and only 5% thought about where they'd like to die, what kind of care they might like at the end of life. And about 26%, mainly of young men, even refused to answer the question. They didn't want to talk about death or think about it. And they said it wasn't only the public who struggled with this topic. Without exception, the doctors involved said that it was not easy to discuss death and dying with their patients. So it's a challenge for the healthcare professionals as well, for many reasons. But they did show that people who'd thought about how they were going to die, had made an advanced care plan, were much more likely to get the care and treatment that was aligned with their preferences and more likely to die in the place of their choice. So they're saying it actually really is beneficial to have some thinking about those topics before the event. And death is clearly something we all have in common. It's absolutely part of the cycle of life, and yet we're quite nervous about it, aren't we? We're quite afraid. I don't think anyone would say that they haven't had times where they've felt anxious about dying. And why is that? You know, it's certainly something out of our control. I guess most of us don't know when or how we're going to die. On the other hand, I guess we didn't know when and how we were going to be born either, did we? So it's really that thing of what role does death play in our life, and how do we feel about it? Maybe we fear that it's going to be painful. We've obviously observed the grief and the pain and the loss that those that are left behind experience, and grief is often a difficult and painful emotion. But it is clear that we've taken death out of our lives. Sometimes we're described as a death-denying society. And so today we really want to shine light on death, take a bit of the sting out of it, make it just much more an acceptable and understandable part of our human condition and human lives. So we're going to start with a very interesting talk by Dr. Peter Fenwick on what happens when you die. And then Yeomans, who's a soul midwife, is really going to talk about what are the qualities that we like to have in someone who's accompanying us when we're dying. And we're going to do a workshop after lunch where you will think about these issues for yourself and some of these themes. And then this afternoon, Sister Jayanti will be addressing some of the more deeper spiritual aspects of what it means to die and our fear of death. I'd like to invite Dr. Craig Brown, who's one of our scientific and medical advisors and has helped a lot on many, many Jayanti Foundation projects, and is a retired GP, but is also a poet, and he's going to share with us some of his poetry. So thank you, Craig.
I'm going to read 3 short poems I've written around death. I think the biggest thing that happened in my life was the death of my wife. She died 4.5 years ago. And the first poem I'm going to read is called A Place to Remember. And I think what had happened after she died, we wanted to do something to remember her with. And on the anniversary of her death, the family gathered and friends gathered, and we all bought a plant, and we planted a small garden as a remembrance garden. So this is a poem about that experience at the time. A Place to Remember. We gathered to remember when a butterfly landed on the bright yellow flowers of the newly planted Mahonia. It stayed a while, showing off the patterns on its wings, brown, yellow, and spots of sapphire. I said some words, and each of us in the silence had our own thoughts, mostly those that made us smile, and being together brought comfort. For a brief moment in this new sacred place, before we put our plants into the soil, mixed with her dust, we were each of us quietly alone. Then the butterfly, ever so gently, flew off, and once more life went on as it must. And on her last anniversary, which is in November this year, there was still the urn with the ashes not fully still there. I don't know if you know, after cremation you get this big urn which is full of ashes, and the challenge is how do you dispose of it. And I kind of thought, as the day came, it was a kind of clear winter's day, and luckily I live quite near the beach, so I decided to take the ashes down to the beach, and a poem came out of that. It's called On Her Anniversary. I went to the beach today, as we often did, picnics with children, me windsurfing, you watching warm summer afternoon swims. Later, grandchildren paddled and played in the sand. Today it is quite still with a low winter sun. I place ashes in the gentle surf, not to wash you away, but to become one with this place. And finally, this is a poem I wrote this week, and as with this conference coming up, I had lots of thoughts about death, and no answers really. So this is a poem about death with no answers. It's called Death. It's a deep mystery, death. My death, yours, and all beings. Where do we go? Who else is there? Darkness or light? In the shade of the cherry tree, a hot summer's day, soft breeze, resting in peace, and the silence beyond is a moment of eternity. Thank you.
I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Peter Fenwick. And Peter and I have known each other for many years, and we were both at the Maudsley. Peter's an emeritus academic and clinician from the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College, Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, with a very deep interest in neuropsychiatry, neurophysiology, but more than that, a very deep interest in consciousness and what happens and what is consciousness and what happens. And I've always seen him as an explorer in this field on the vanguard. And I heard him give this talk at the British Union of Spiritists Society, and there's some people from there today, and I thought, what an amazing talk. It was really like death was a great adventure and very upbeat. So I was very delighted when Peter agreed to give the talk with some additions. I believe he's always updating it. And Peter and his wife Elizabeth, who's also with us, have written a book called The Art of Dying, which, again, I would strongly recommend. I think people can get it on Amazon, or where to get it on Amazon. So, Peter, would you like to come and share your explorations, your voyage into the territory of consciousness?
What a pleasure it is to be here. It really is, because I've had a long relationship with the Brahma Kumaris, always wonderfully life-enhancing. And I think that the work the Brahma Kumaris do is just absolutely magnificent. So it's a real pleasure to be back here. Now you see that I, in fact, have put Sarah's title on my slide. And that's because I think it's such a really good title. It's Shining Light on Death, but we need to understand it. So what I'm going to do is take you through the dying process as I understand it now. Because we know little about the dying process, we don't realize how important it is. And believe you me, it is enormously important. We've mainly been concerned with pain control and physical comfort, and so we should have been, because that's very important. We have to go beyond that. We're all attached to life, and we won't face death. And wasn't that fascinating? Sarah's figures that she gave you. 11% of GPs frightened about death. Come on. And they're dealing with it. You see, in our culture, we fear death and shut it out by not discussing it. Last time you went to a party, did you say to the person next door, well, I'm going to die, and so are you. What are you going to do about it? They would say, it was terribly nice of you to come. We still do not understand and have just started to study the subjective and spiritual process of dying. This is all new. There are very few studies of phenomena surrounding the time of death, and they are fascinating. There's uncertainty about whether such phenomena are spiritual or organic. But does it matter? It's what you're going to experience. Where it comes from, you're not worried about. And many carers feel they lack training in how to respond, as Sarah has told you, when dealing with these phenomena. So what are these end-of-life phenomena? Let's have a look. You can see some of us have premonitions, and the premonitions will come up to about 2 years. The Dalai Lama says that all of us know when we're going to die, and all of us have some sort of thing. Well, if we all know we're going to die, how do we do it? What is it that gives us an indication? Well, I just don't understand it. The Dalai Lama says it's something to do with breath. But I don't know what that means. But at any rate, a few of us do have very clear premonitions. And then we come to the next one, which is deathbed visions. These are very important. Talk to most doctors in palliative care. How many doctors in palliative care are there here? One. Do you talk about deathbed visions? No. Yes. It's a real shame because it is so important, actually. And got it. And it's important because of the significance they have for the dying. Okay, this is usually occurring about 3 to 4 weeks before you die. And I've seen people use these very creatively. For example, in Canada, at one of the palliative care meetings, one of the nurses came up and said, nobody dies alone. Nobody dies alone. And they don't die alone, generally because they're picked up. And she said, so what I tell the people who are dying is, who do you think will pick you up? And they would say, Mary or somebody. And so she says, well, just wait till Mary comes. And when she comes, go with her. And that's really very comforting for the dying. This I'm going to talk about because it is enormously important. This is where the growth area is in the new reality that you go into and out of before you die. I'm not going to talk about terminal lucidity. That's for the scientists. When people have been injured and paralyzed and even have schizophrenia just before death, they wake up into normal consciousness, and the paralyzed with them, they'll move. How and why, but that's not for us. And then death comes. Sorry about that thing, bit scary. Let's do something about it. What about that? And that's much better. Do you see the hearts? Because this is absolutely central to the process. Deathbed coincidences we won't have time to, but it's when the dying person goes and contacts somebody at the moment of death and tells them they're going to be okay. And then, of course, there are clocks which stop, animals which howl, bells which ring, light in the room, very important, and shapes seen leaving the body. So those are all really very exciting things which do occur when we die. So how well are our carers trained to recognize them? Well, we only got anybody a palliative care nurse here? Okay, well, you can answer this question. How well are you trained about end-of-life phenomena? No? No. Well, look, this is our survey. In the English retrospective one, there not even 10% have been trained. The Dutch are much better. They're all taught about it, which is excellent. The Irish, even less than we are. And in a prospective study, it's only 10% of people. So there's a huge void here in some of the most important experiences which occur before death. So let's look at some of the recent work which is changing our view of dying. And believe you me, it is changing in a major way. This is a 2016 paper, Seeing the Light, End-of-Life Experiences, Visions, etc. And this talks about deathbed phenomena. Look, this is a major publication. And so it's coming at long last into the scientific frame. And what he says that the last hours of life are not easily explained within a traditional medical model. It's very important. And that's why I said, don't go for is it organic or is it spiritual. We actually can't use these to explain it. There's not enough data. And most consistent caregivers, nurses, assess, recognize, and validate such experiences. The nurses do, the doctors don't. And here's another one. This is by Alan Kelleher, 2014. It's a book, The Inner Life of the Dying Person. And this book recounts the experiences of facing one's death solely from the dying person's point of view. This is a huge shift, you see. And if you look at the bottom, we can also feel courage, love, hope, reminiscence, transcendence, transformation, and even happiness as we die. Now, dying can be joyful, and I hope to show you the evidence which supports that remark. This is the book Sarah was kindly talking about. In case you hadn't heard of it, I'll put it up here. You can get it on Amazon. And we wrote this, and you're all very welcome to have it. It's nearing the end of life. Sue, who I work with, wrote it when her dad was dying. And it's a brochure for relatives of the dying. And we had a number, this was funded by a charity, and we have a number of these which we're happy to give away. Okay, so what does the Dalai Lama and death? And please take what he says seriously. If you've not practiced rituals, what's rituals? Calming the mind down, meditating, thinking about what death is, setting yourself in the right frame of mind to die. You're dying, and on your dying day, you're surrounded by sobbing friends and others involved in your affairs. Instead of having someone who reminds you of virtuous practice, in other words, somebody to keep the spiritual and loving atmosphere in the room when you die, this will only bring trouble, and you brought it on yourself, guys. Where does the fault lie? In not being mindful of impermanence. So you're all going to die. None of you think you're going to die, but we all are. So learn about it. Do you like that one? Dying doesn't scare me, it's you people. So I think that's rather nice. Now, the other thing is, you can not worry about it at all. Don't do anything, don't care about it. That's how you'll die in the intensive care unit. Do you really want that? No, of course you don't, because you want to experience the dying process. You don't want to experience the farthest reaches of supportive medicine. So let's examine the death process. You get the diagnosis, okay? It's terminal. You're going to die, so you actually then start the dying process. You should have been doing this for months and months, but then you start the dying process. You're usually unprepared, unfortunately. But what does it mean to be unprepared? Your entrance into the dying process should not be with feelings of fear, God, I don't want to die, or feelings of anger and rejection, how can this be happening to me? Or with feelings of loss, I'm going to lose my children, my wife, and that new house which I've just bought. No good. And feelings of sadness. That's not a good way to go into it. But you must go in with curiosity. Curiosity. What's going to happen? Curiosity is a very neutral word. It's just an openness to explore. And that's a really good attitude. With feelings of acceptance. Yep, had a good life, or not had a good life, but this is where we are. And only very few of you from a position of knowledge, but you all want to be knowledgeable. So to progress easily to death, and please listen, everything must be given, everything must be given up. Everything. No, I mean everything. A shroud has no pockets. You're not going to take anything, guys. Everything must be given up. Now, that seems a strange thing to say, but I'll give you more data towards that. So have central the idea that you're going to give up everything. Not everybody does it. It's hard to give up. In fact, this is a patient. I mean, it was a friend whose bed we were sitting on, and she had about three days to live. Who's going to look after my little car? Do you see? Totally inappropriate as you're dying. In fact, I think she was talking about her daughter, but couldn't even face that. So, no, everything has to be given up. So end-of-life experiences give help in the final few weeks, and this is why they're so important, and this is why they should be taught in every hospice. So we set out to find the nature of end-of-life experiences. We interviewed the carers of the dying starting in 2003, so this really goes back now. And we did a 5-year retrospective study. That means we asked the carers of the dying what they'd come across in the previous 5 years, then a 1-year prospective study. in that we said, okay, now you know about these things, go out and find out how often they occur. 1 palliative care team, 2 English and 3 Dutch hospices, 1 nursing home, 1 Irish hospice study done by Una McConville. We're data rich because we got over 1,000 emails, because I went on Richard and Duty with my wife and asked people for experiences, and they sent them in. So we really know what happens. And we interviewed doctors, nurses, auxiliary staff, chaplains, and volunteers. Those are the lovely people that I worked with. Sue Brain, Hilary Lovelace, and Inika Kodam. Inika Kodam did the ROTTERDAM studies, and Dr. Una McColville. So, present consensus, and are you listening? And are you listening closely? It's about 90% of those dying consciously will have an end-of-life experience. So that is amazing. So you're going to be taken care of. Looks as if whether you like it or not, actually, you can refuse to die. You won't win. So let's start with deathbed visions. Here's one of our stories. I joined my daughter after an hour at the hospital, and we both sat chatting to my mother. She spoke to me about my life and my future, all interspersed with references to these people who are now at the end of her bed. They come very close. She told us that she wouldn't be there the next day, as these people would pick her up when she fell and take her on a journey. So this idea of a journey at that point starts coming in strongly. We were slightly spooked at her comments, but she was totally at ease. She insisted that we shouldn't cry when she died, but when they came back on Christmas Eve, she had. So do you see, these people are there to look after her. Sometimes they are dead relatives. These are just the results for you. Deathbed visions, the English retro study, the Dutch retro study. 70% of the carers knew and had these stories. But even in the English prospectus study, when they went out for a year to find out what happened, do you see, nearly 50% heard these things. They're common. So deathbed visitors often sit on the bed. Why? Any of you who've had a sick child will know exactly why you sit on the bed. It's enormously comforting for them. It's very comforting for you as well. So the deathbed visitors sit on the bed often, yes. Look, 60%, and the prospectus study was over 50. So yes, the deathbed visitors come near, they sit on the bed, and they're there to help you. So use them. So who are the visitors? Well, we took 118 visions and asked this question. A quarter of the visitors were parents. Well, that's nice, if you got on well with your parents. Persons unknown, usually spiritual, are 17. And those people who can't speak will sometimes hold their hands out in a joyful response with no speech. Relatives 14, spouses 14. I'm terribly sorry, guys. Very few angels. Yeah, sad. We've got 3% only. And very few friends. I'd like more friends. But in fact, if you go to the Bible Belt in America, there are loads of angels down there. So go and die in the Bible Belt and you get an angel. There you are. I thought it was going to be my mum, and it was, and it will be, probably, in a quarter of cases. So we can ask the question, who sees them? Well, the dying do. Rarely others in the room, especially children, so they're seen by other people, and very rarely hospice or hospital staff. So other people do see the visitors and report them. How do they come? They often come into the room shortly before death, will stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room, appear in real space as the dying direct their gaze and comment at a particular place, maybe more than one person. Occasionally unknown people wait at a distance and come closer, and these are the spiritual beings who come closer as you become weaker and approach towards death. Why do they come? It's worth thinking. To greet them, yes. To reassure them that they will be with them, very helpful. To tell them when it's time to go. So don't forget, if you get a deathbed visitor, you say, how much longer have I got? That's okay. To take them on a journey, and they can be negotiated with, and time of death delayed for a short while. You can't say, there's a hospice party coming up, guys, I want to be there. No, nothing like that. But they will do it. Here's somebody who'd been using delaying tactics. My sister heard Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room, fearing that one of her children had gone on and upset him. She went in to see what was going on. Only Dad was there in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go. He knew I was coming and was determined to stay alive until I'd seen him, and of course he did. So you can manipulate things a little, but remember, you're in the process of giving everything up. Now, let's talk about moving to a new reality, which is where the new breakthroughs are. There it is. So, towards the end of the journey, what does towards the end of the journey mean? About a week, maybe 10 days. You start going into this new reality, and you go in, you experience it, and you come back again. It's a fascinating process. And so we can ask questions about what is the new reality like, and what is the significance of it. And don't forget light in the room. Light in the room is very common, and shapes leaving the body at the time of death are common too. Now, what I've put up there is non-dual consciousness. And this is where our understanding of death has changed enormously. We lose our normal form, leave our normal form of consciousness, and come into non-dual consciousness. Just as a show of hands, how many of you here know what non-dual consciousness is? Yeah, okay. Well, do learn about it, because it's going to be terribly important, and we'll have a look at this. And look at the bottom thing, transformation of consciousness, which is which arises as death occurs. Here's an example: 32-year-old woman dying of breast cancer in the last 2 to 3 days. It's around that time. She's conscious, dark roof over her head, bright light. She moved into a waiting place where beings were talking to her, there to help her. Okay? So it's what I said, really. Everything will be okay. Loving beings. And she's very clear it's not a dream. It feels real, real, real. Her grandfather was amongst them. And she moved in and out of this area. Hospice, new reality. Hospice, new reality. And here's another one. My father was at my grandfather's bedside, deeply distressed. But my grandfather quietly said to my father, don't worry. This is the dying reassuring the people in the room. I am all right. I can see and hear the most beautiful things, and you must not worry. And he quietly died, lucid to the end. Okay? Do you get it? They're there to help you and support you. Well, these are the figures. They're not quite as strong as deathbed visions, but in the English prospective study, you see they actually go up to very nearly 50%. So yeah, the carers know about these things. So let's talk a little bit more about this. And remember that you're transforming your consciousness as you're dying. This is the new data, and I'll explain why I think the data is good. So it's a transformation of consciousness. It's experienced by 90% of the dying. That's what the figures show, if you die conscious. Very like the NDE world, which of course is light, love, and compassion. Wholeness and feelings of unity. Can you see this enormous healing which is taking place as you move towards death? Waiting area with spiritual beings and dead relatives are present, so your mum may be there if you want her. Here you are. My life partner died of AIDS-related pneumonia at home in 1991. I spent the last week lying beside him at home much of the time, and on one or two occasions a look of sheer ecstasy lit up his face, and he smiled and looked at something I couldn't see. So this is the quality of it, ecstatic. Now, this is a paper I want you all to get. You can get it. You have to send me an email and put the words Monica Rentz on it, and I will send it to you. It's called Fear, Pain, Denial, and Spiritual Experience in the Dying Process. In the Medical Journal of Hospital Medicine. So it's gone round, hospice medicine. It's gone round all the hospices. And do note, it's a 2017 paper, so it's right at the cutting edge of what happens now. If you want it, there's my address. Don't send me an email, except to say Monica Rentz in the subject line, and I'll click on the paper and send it back to you. She's talking about how we should deal with these new facts that are coming out. Spirituality includes more than just giving a response to a patient's spiritual attitude. Spiritual needs, as well as patients' consciousness and communication, are changing during the dying process. I'll put it up at the end. Spirituality has to do with an altered connectedness and consciousness, okay? So spirituality has to do with an altered connectedness and consciousness. Spiritual experiences are powerfully independent of religious attitudes. So it actually doesn't matter what you believe, and we've got quite a lot of people who believe there's no life after death, and then they, in fact, start experiencing these things. So that's what Monica Rentz says. She's written a book, Dying a Transition. I have one which I'll send to you, which you can put in your library. It's a good book. So she argues, and I'm sure she's right, that there are three phases in dying, which she calls pre-transition, transition, and post-transition. So what does she mean? If she'd done a little study, that's one thing. If she'd done a comprehensive good study, that's another. This is a comprehensive good study. There were 80 patients who died of cancer in her study. She did at least 3 observations a day and rated 4 dimensions: fear, pain, denial, and spiritual experience. That means these 80 patients had somebody interviewing them 3 times a day. So very good hand on the process as it evolves. And from those observations, she determined the transition level. Remember, the process of dying is an expansion of consciousness. It's quite new, really. You see, it's a new concept that you die. And in the dying process, you expand your consciousness. I mean, it's really terrific. So let's see what pre-transition is. We're now in egoic consciousness. What we are now, all of us feeling that there's a person here, he can do things, and all the needs you have is thirst, needs for bonding, pain and emotions, fear and joy, just as we are now. And interestingly, many fear losing control and their dignity and realize dying is inevitable. Now, fortunately, all you people are going to be prepared, and you know you've got to give everything up. So when you realize dying is inevitable, you think of what has been found, and that is that it is going to be an expansion of consciousness. So blocks to going on to the next stage, what you think. Patients can be locked in the pre-transition due to denial. I'm not really dying, guys. I know you all think I am, but I'm not. Wrong. You reactivate traumas and struggles. In fact, you haven't given everything up. You don't let it go, and you hold it, and you hold it, and you hold it. Strong attachment to unresolved family issues and awareness of previous negative behavior. These will all hold you back. Give it up. Give the whole lot up. To help them through the period, the carers are going to have to be taught not just to give midazolam if people are in terminal anxiety, but to support them and release them from attachments and help the patients to move on. And that actually is quite a different sort of thought. Now let's move on to the next step, which is transition. Transition itself implies the loosening of ego consciousness. Remember that. So what we were starts to fade away, and the new consciousness comes up. Sometimes patients don't like giving this up, and they show physical signs of anxiety and struggle, but you won't because you know about it. Some patients simply stare or restless, and old traumas may be reactivated. And then you come to post-transitional. Now, the ego is not dominant anymore. It's non-symbolic, non-dual consciousness. You have a vast expansion of consciousness. You become cosmic. So there is a huge change in what you really are. Patients seem to be serene in a state of being beyond anxiety, pain, or powerlessness. Many are unable to speak and still hear. Remember that. Don't let a family call a dying person back, because they'll come. Sometimes reconciliation, vision, and peace are observed, and such transformative experiences may be comparable to a spiritual awakening, and it's the completion of the journey. I mean, it is enormously exciting. And what's the word you're all going to take home? Curious. We are curious. Now, these are Monica Rentz is one of her patients. These are days. One day, that's 26th, 27th, etc., through until death. These are the levels: pre-transition, transition, post-transition. This is where you become universal. This is where you have done most of the work allowing you to go on. And this is where you're fighting. Do you see? All those traumas, not wanting to give it up, being attached, etc. So the path that you follow will be different. Here's another one from another of her patients. Starts up there, goes rapidly into this non-dual state, hovers in there, comes back again a bit, but ends up in the non-dual state at the end. So you'll have a variable progress through it, but the progress is always down. Now, this one I like very much indeed, and we ought to remember this. What Monica has done here, she's taken almost no suffering, that's the yellow bars, moderate or much suffering, that's the blue bars. So the higher the yellow bars are, the larger the number of people had very little suffering. So we can now ask what was different about them. Well, the tallest one here, nearly 90%, is in fact near-death experiences. So if you have a near-death experience, you're going to be okay. Another 2/3, I like to meditate. Okay, if you're all getting your life in order. And here's another one, 60%, I like to pray. So these are all protective of you in the end. Positive life experiences, nearly up to 60. Another interesting one is, and this will be all of you, no fear at the time of admission, okay? Because you'll have given it up. You'll understand the process. You won't be fearful. And they go through, 60% of them. And the one I like is, I am curious about the afterlife. And they hit a good 63%, okay? So keep the word curious, and when you're in the hospice, just think back to that talk given by some strange guy who said I should be curious. Okay, here's some people from our database. Suddenly she stared intently up at the window. This lasted only 1 minute, but it seemed ages. she suddenly turned to me and said, "Please, Pauline, don't ever be afraid of dying." This is the dying person reassuring the family. I've seen a beautiful light and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful. I really had to fight to come back. That looks very much like a near-death experience. In fact, it's an actual death experience. But I knew she had seen something that day which gave her comfort and peace when she knew she only had hours to live. Here's another one. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife. Hadn't read the book, Teddy. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful and arose from her unconsciousness. So note, she goes unconscious, comes back, goes unconscious and comes back. And when she's unconscious, she's saying clearly and happily such phrases, "I will know soon, come on, get on with it." So it's very much like the sort of process I've been describing. She'd immediately lapsed back into unconsciousness after uttering those phrases. She was very obviously content, happy, and at peace. It was a wonderful experience for her partner and me. So it actually doesn't matter if you believe that nothing's going to happen. It is. It's got its own metric, you see. You should be able to die where you want, home, special spiritual units, and special spiritual hospital units if they start building those, which they suggest they will. So please make plans. You have to, unless you want to end up with all those tubes. Now, are there such hospices that are really founded on this principle? Well, yes, there are. And here's one in Rotterdam. There's such a house, a small hospice called the Viervogel, the Four Birds, staffed by two wonderful nurses, Simone de Kuyper and Suzanne van Westerbrugge. And they run the hospital and look after the patients, with volunteers, of course. They confirm that the phenomena we've been talking about today regularly occur in their hospice, so they're there. And they describe a strong, emotional pulse of love felt in the room of the dying. So if you get everything quiet and allow the dying process to go forward, it's a very loving experience. And they ring Tibetan chimes to celebrate somebody who's passing. And then they do a nice thing. They give them a candle, which has got 3 birds on it, and the 4th one flying away. It's nice and thick, and they're encouraged to keep it alight and, until the funeral. Now, an old friend of mine, Professor Paul Robertson, had an NDE some years before he died, so it's a very personal story. There he is, Medici Quartet. Some of you will remember, maybe. A very talented musician. But during a half-hour operation to repair a tear in his aorta, Paul was under a general anesthetic and unconscious. His heart was stopped and his head cooled to prepare his brain for a period of brain oxygen starvation. In his book, Paul describes very clearly what he experienced while in this deeply unconscious state, between life and death. He was, he says, fully aware that he was dying. Okay, so this guy's unconsciousness, no blood to the brain. And moving from this state to experience of the potential unification of his consciousness with that of the universe. I said you become conscious, cosmic. This is what he's telling us. As I lay there waiting, I felt myself die. And note the words he uses. Beautifully, ecstatically, transcendentally. I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. Okay? So why did he come back? He came back because the family pulled him back. They played his CDs to him. They told him they weren't ready for him to go and everything like that. But I'm pleased he did come back because it gave me an opportunity to discuss with Paul the whole process of dying and the change in consciousness at that time. And so we went through the dying process in great detail. And I said, I will try and be there when you die because I want you to tell me everything you experience. But in fact, I was there the day before. I missed it by 1 day. But when Paul actually died 2 years ago, his wife and family were with him. This time they were prepared and encouraged him to go. Yeah, quite different. And his wife told me what happened shortly before he died. Paul woke up slightly from a deep sleep and told me, I must let Peter Fenwick know. But there's nothing new. We've all been there before. Really cool. So that's the closest I think we're going to get to it. And the data is very like Monica Rentz's. Everything is pointing in that direction. So the final transition is the crumbling of the ego. So you've got to give everything up. Subject-object consciousness transforms to non-symbolic consciousness, and all is a divine unity. So that's what you're heading to. As I lie there waiting, Paul's words again. I felt myself die beautifully, ecstatically, transcendently, and I saw eternity and shed the whole of myself joyfully in order to become unified with it. Okay? What you afraid of, guys? What you afraid of? It would seem that we're never born and we never die. So what are you afraid of? I hope after this you'll go out and be curious, at the very least. Now, I put this in, Sister Jayanti, really because I'm speaking to the Brahma Kumaris. I never actually talk about experiences that I've had, but I want you to see that these are the experiences all of you can have anytime. And this was the silent retreat we did here. And for me, it was a magnificent retreat. There was no difference between me and the divine love and light. In other words, I'd changed my level of consciousness. Consciousness streamed through me, and that is what creation is. No me, no looking, wanting, discussing, all entirely false. I don't exist, never did, just the endless flow of the divine. It constructs the moment, is the moment, and when it ceases to manifest, it then returns to the unmanifest. Now, you all will have experiences like this, but they are, in fact, preludes to what you're going to experience when you die. And the data, I think, is very good. Okay, so it's only Monica Rentz that's done really the first powerful study. But because of the data which we have, which all point in the same direction, I think it will certainly hold. So, let me thank you all very much indeed for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Okay. So I think you can all appreciate why I wanted you to hear that talk. Fantastic, wasn't it? Really, really helpful. And all of Peter's work, research, personal experiences have gone into it. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.